Hello and welcome to the Art of Being Human. We've been talking about different types of anxiety, and I've listed off the various types because there are differences between them. And so I thought maybe if I go through them one at a time, getting more deeply involved with them, you might be able to pinpoint what kind of anxiety you have. But I don't want you to get discouraged, because just because you have any one type of anxiety and they kind of blend in with one another, it doesn't mean you're less worthy of a person. It doesn't mean that you can't accomplish great things in life. Lots and lots of people have anxiety and they live with it, but I'm trying to help them to get over it so they won't have to live with it. And you can be creative either way. Before I start that and go over the different types of anxiety and their symptoms, we went over general anxiety disorder at the last session, but I may do that again, just as a review. I want to read you some things. There are certain things and certain people that have decided that others aren't worthy, and those people that they considered that weren't worthy have accomplished great things. So I wanted to read a little bit of this to you, and you can see how foolish it is to try to judge what a person can do when they can do a lot more than what they even think or what other people think. Now, here's what was said of Vince Lombardi. He possesses minimal football knowledge. He lacks motivation. Now, that's not true, of course. Socrates was called an immoral corrupter of youth, and yet he was a very famous philosopher. Beethoven handled the violin awkwardly and preferred playing his own compositions instead of improving his technique. His teacher called him hopeless as a composer. You can't consider Beethoven hopeless as a composer. The parents of the famous opera singer Enrico Caruso wanted him to be an engineer. His teacher said he had no voice at all and could not sing. He's one of the most famous opera singers of all times. Well, it goes on here. Walt Disney was fired by a newspaper editor for lack of ideas. Walt Disney, of all things. Thomas Edison's teacher said he was too stupid to learn anything, although he had a lot to do with the light bulbs. Albert Einstein did not speak until he was 4 years old and didn't read until he was 7. His teacher described him as mentally slow and unsociable. That obviously is not true. Louis Pasteur was only a mediocre pupil, and he ranked 15th out of 22nd in chemistry, but he was the one who helped to get antibiotics going. Isaac Newton did very poorly in grade school. The sculptor Rodin's father said, "I have an idiot for a son." He was one of the greatest sculptors in history. Leo Tolstoy, author of War and Peace, flunked out of college. He was described as both unable and unwilling to learn. F.W. Woolworth's employers at the dry goods store said he had not enough sense to wait upon customers, and yet he is one of the originators of the 5 and dime stores. Henry Ford failed and went broke 5 times before he finally succeeded. Now, I could go on with this. 18 publishers turned down Richard Bach's 10,000-word story about a soaring seagull, and he wrote Jonathan Livingston Seagull, one of the best written books in history. It sold more than 7 million copies. So just assume that if somebody says a person can't do something, then they may not succeed, that's probably not true. If you've ever been told that you can't succeed because you've got this disorder or that disorder, you don't have to believe it. You just have to go for it and see how far you get. So anxiety will not cripple you to the point where you can't be productive. Anxiety may put limits on you, but it doesn't have to. You can work through it, you can get help with it, and you can go on with your life. Now, I want to review once again general anxiety symptoms, general anxiety disorder and the symptoms. We did it before. A lot of people have it, And the symptoms are very distressing for anxiety because you feel like you're being crippled. You feel like you can't be productive. You feel like you can't do anything. But these are the symptoms, and many people have it. It's very treatable if you get help with it, but these are the symptoms. You get tired for no reason. You get headaches. You have muscular tension and aches, hard time swallowing, trembling, twitching, irritable, sweating, nausea, lightheaded, and out of breath. You use the bathroom a lot, and you have hot flushes or hot flashes. These are the typical symptoms of the general anxiety disorder. And it's easy enough for me to sit down and read them off. But if you're suffering from them, especially if you have a group of them at the same time, it's extremely hard to deal with. But yet you can get help with it. Now, a panic attack is something different. A panic attack is when the very great feelings of terror hit you out of nowhere, and you don't know why they're there. And I've told a story about the student that I saw when I was a college professor, and she was in the hall just screaming, and I thought she was being attacked or something, so I ran out of my office into the hall, and she was sitting there all alone just screaming at the top of her lungs. But the panic attack is so bad, it is so hard to deal with, that gradually you just don't want to do anything. You do not want to go out in public. You're afraid you're going to have one, and what's going to happen? You aren't going to be able to handle it. Well, let me read off the symptoms of the panic attack. There is a feeling of terror for no reason, and this is probably the main symptom. You feel that life is threatening. You feel that it can happen anywhere, as indeed it can. Your heart will be racing and pounding. It's hard to breathe. It's fear of imminent death. It can be so frightening that a person actually thinks they're having a heart attack and they think they're going to die. There is sweatiness, dizziness, vertigo, trembling and shaking, nausea, hot and cold feelings, sometimes together, tingling hands and feet, numbness, you can't get enough air, you feel like you're suffocating, you have pain in the chest, which is sometimes confused with a heart attack, and there is the fear of it's happening again, causing people to avoid social situations. And so what happens is that if you have panic attacks, it may end up that you develop a phobia with it, because a lot of these kinds of fears kind of intertwine with each other. One can lead to another. And why would you be phobic? You would be afraid of going to social events because you might have a panic attack. And then you can create a panic attack because you got to go somewhere and you're afraid you're going to have one, so you almost bring it on yourself. And yet it can happen for no reason. And there you are with terrible terror. You don't know what's happening. You don't know what to do. The symptoms are awful. And it's no doubt possible to develop a phobia of social situations, even going out to get groceries, because you're afraid that something's going to happen and you're going to have it. I think one of the worst things that happens with any kind of panic or any kind of anxiety disorder, if it's a strong anxiety disorder, even if it's not that bad, the thing that you're afraid of most is going to have to go through it alone without any help. And you're there and you don't know what to do for it, and you don't have anyone to help you with it. You can't talk to anybody, you can't see anybody, there's nobody around that's going to help you, and you don't know what to do. And as the end result is, you might even start screaming. And you're afraid that you might start screaming. Some people are afraid to get groceries. What if they feel so panicked when they get groceries that all they want to do is stop their grocery shopping and run out of the store? So they check for exits. If I have to leave, where are the exits? How did I get in? What's the closest door to get out? And it becomes a complicated morass of symptoms. How do I get out of the symptoms? No one's going to help me. And that kind of thing makes you panic even more. But these are the symptoms of the panic attack, and it is a fear that it'll happen again, and it causes people to avoid social situation. And so what they develop out of that is a phobia, the simple phobia and a complex phobia. We are going to get into that next, the phobias. There are two types, simple and complex. The simple phobia is the fact that you've been bitten by a dog, so now you're afraid of dogs. I mean, one thing leads to another thing, and you're fine until you get to see a dog. Now, that's an example of it, but that's the way a simple phobia is. Something happens to you, and then you're afraid it's going to happen again. But generally speaking, in a simple phobia, you don't have any fear unless you're facing that thing that you're afraid of. If you're afraid of horses, you could go through your life without seeing a horse and you wouldn't have any fear. But get you close to a horse and then you'll panic. That's what a simple phobia is like. Now, unfortunately for phobias, they tend to spread. They tend to get worse. And when they get worse, pretty soon you're not just afraid of a dog because it has 4 legs and it bit you. You're afraid of a rabbit that has 4 legs. You're afraid of a cat that has 4 legs. You're afraid of all 4-legged creatures because heaven knows, if you were bitten by a dog, who knows, you might get bitten by something else that has 4 legs. So the tendency, if you have a phobia, unless it's treatable, unless you get rid of it somehow or damp it down, you're going to continue to be plagued with it in situations that you wouldn't expect to be, because it's going to get worse. The fear is going to start to grow, and it's going to include other things. Now, a complex phobia is that you have a generalized fear of many things, and then it all kind of combines into one thing that is symbolic of the rest. So it's like a fear of something, and that fear spreads and it's generalized. So you are phobic about several things, but you can't pinpoint what it was that started it to begin with. You don't remember the simple phobia. You just have general anxiety, and instead of having it focused on one thing, it can be focused on many things. But what's happening, of course, is that it's combining, and it becomes symbolic of other things that you're afraid of. It's much harder to treat because of that. But phobias are very, very treatable. So whether it's simple or complex, any kind of anxiety and any kind of anxiety disorder that I'm talking about is very treatable. So is depression, and panic and depression and fear and depression oftentimes go together. Now, there are about 100 phobias that are listed, and you have panic when you're faced with whatever it is that you're afraid of. And if it's claustrophobia, it's fear of being in small places. A lot of people are afraid to go into elevators. Our lights went out this morning in our apartment building, and the first thing I thought of was, oh, thank heavens I wasn't in the elevator. But it came right back on again. It wasn't anything to do with what was happening in the building. But we have had power outages before, and the fear is, what if I get stuck in an elevator and I can't get out and the lights are out? What do I do? Well, there are some emergency buttons and call buttons that you can use, but I have heard, now it's never happened to me, but if I have heard that if you get stuck in an elevator, the best thing that you can do, if you can do it, is sit down on the floor. The reason being is it looks like there's a lot more space around you, and so you're not apt to be so afraid. If you're standing up, you're aware of the small space around you. If you sit down, it seems like there's more space around you, and it may help you not to be so afraid. I was only stuck in an elevator once, and for some reason, and it was good, I didn't panic. I heard a funny sound, and I could hear that the elevator was stopping. I didn't know which floor I was on, or even if I was between floors, but there it was stopping. And I punched buttons. I just punched the buttons to the floors, and suddenly the elevator started again, and it went to a floor and opened the doors. It wasn't the floor that I wanted. I didn't care. I just got out of the elevator. Once I was out of the elevator, I could walk to whatever floor I wanted. And this morning, when the lights went out, all I could think of was those poor people in the elevator. Once the elevator died, it was during a thunderstorm. So now I don't use the elevators during a thunderstorm because there's a possibility of the fact that the lights could go out. Rarely do we have that problem. I really mean rarely. But when the lights went out during the storm, and I thought somebody must be in the elevator. And I walked with a flashlight, since there were no lights, down to the elevator, and I banged on the door to see if there was anybody there, to see if anybody was calling out for help. And I called out and no response, so I figured there was no one on the elevator, and I went back to my apartment. And gradually, of course, the lights went on. As it turned out, there was somebody on the elevator, but of course, they couldn't have heard me call to them. The elevator was too far away. The carriage was too far away from me. If I'd known somebody was in it, I just would have called 911 or something to see if somebody could come and get them out. But at any rate, being afraid of small places, you know, it's a hard thing to have, but there are elevators everywhere. Now, here are some other more common kinds of phobias. Arachnophobia. If you have arachnophobia, you are afraid of spiders. Aquaphobia is a fear of water. I would imagine that would mean at beaches or trying to swim or something like that, a fear of drowning. You wouldn't think anyone would be afraid of washing dishes, which uses water, but maybe so. Aviophobia is a fear of flying. There are a lot of people that are afraid of flying. Bacillophobia is that you are afraid of germs. Cynophobia, you are afraid of dogs. Hemophobia, you are afraid of blood. Necrophobia, you are afraid of death. Ophneophobia, you're afraid of snakes. Nomophobia, being alone. You are afraid of xenophobia, you are afraid of strangers. So those are the common lists of types of phobias that you can have. And you have to think in terms of what is the chance that you're actually going to get stuck in an elevator, or what is the chance that you're going to have to face something that you're afraid of? Well, possibly you will be every day. If you're afraid of water, maybe every day. If you're afraid of crossing bridges, maybe not so much, because you can avoid bridges, you just drive around them in a general way, in another direction. The way that you can get over a fear, there are treatments for it, that you can gradually become desensitized. If I had a person that I was seeing in counseling and they were afraid of bridges, I would let them first look at pictures of bridges. Now, this seems pretty simple. You're not facing the bridge, you're looking at it. But for some people that are very sensitive, it's very common that they can't even look at a picture of a bridge without getting some kind of a sensory response. They're going to get some kind of a feeling of fear just looking at it, because it's just reminding them of what they're afraid of. It's kind of bringing it up. And you can be afraid, say you're afraid of going to the dentist. You're not at a dentist's office. Maybe your appointment is a month away. You can still be afraid for the entire month because you know it's coming up. And it's also, you know, an anticipatory fear because you're facing something that actually is going to happen. But when you get there, it's not so fearful because it's now no longer anticipation. It is actually a present-day reality, and so the anticipatory nature of the fear leaves, and sometimes you don't have the fear that you thought you were going to have. Now, there is a social anxiety, and it affects people, men and women, equally, and they're afraid of social situations. They're afraid of being out in a crowd. They're afraid of going to a friend's house where there are going to be several people, maybe a dinner party or something. They don't know if they're going to have full control of what their fears are when they get there. You know, I am not plagued with any of this, but some people are plagued by it, and they just can't go to dinner parties. They just can't go to weddings. They just can't go to receptions. They can't go anywhere where they might face people and feel that something's going to happen. They're going to be made fun of. Somebody's going to make a distracting comment that's going to affect them. They're going to feel like they're lost somehow. They're not going to be able to mix in like they want to mix in. Well, that's terrible if you can't mix in with people. But this is what it's like, the social phobia. Now, OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder. Obsessive compulsive disorder is when you have to do things a certain way. You are compulsive about everything you do. If you have to wash your hands 5 times after you use the bathroom, and you have to do it every time because that's your compulsion, you have to do it. And supposing you go out of the bathroom and you touch something, it might have a germ on it or something. So then you've got to start all over again and wash your hands another 5 times. And it has to be 5 times. 4 won't do it, 3 won't do it, 1 won't do it. And you have to continually do this over and over again. Supposing your compulsion is you have to button your sweater with the buttons in a certain order. Well, you don't make the order. Somehow the order gets mixed up. What do you have to do? Take off your sweater, put it back on, and rebutton it again. There is a case of a woman who had some kind of a phobia like this, and she was very compulsive, and she took a shower, and when she got her sweater on, and she was supposed to button it in a certain order, and she missed the order somehow, she had to go back in her bedroom, take her clothes off, and start off with another shower. It was the sequel of events that was important. So she had to shower again, even though she just showered, and get dressed again, and put on the sweater again, and then start rebuttoning it. Now, if she had missed it, she would have had to do the same thing again. This can be quite crippling, because you have to do things in a certain order. If you're walking on the street, you have to put your right foot on every crack. You can't put your left foot on the crack. It has to be the right foot. And if it's not the right foot, and say the sidewalk has cement and it has cement blocks, so there are cracks between each block, what you have to do is you have to go back and start again. Now, why do people do this? What's the problem? You have obsessive thoughts. These thoughts are always negative, and they're always intrusive. And what you are doing, what your body is doing, it's trying to manage the obsessive thoughts by doing things to cover it up, so that if you can be compulsive about doing such things, that it covers up or shoves away the obsessive thoughts that are bothering you. And if you miss it, you start all over again. It can be a very debilitating disorder. If you say are driving and you've driven 5 miles, did I lock the house? I might not have locked the house. Well, I think I locked the house. I remember I locked the house. But what if I didn't? Just this one thought. What if I didn't do what I think I did? Back 5 miles, go back to your house, and of course it's locked because you locked it. And then you drive another 10 miles. I'm wondering if I really did. See, the idea is, what if that little obscure thing is such, that little thought is so powerful that it can make me doubt something that I know I did? Did I turn the stove off? I think I turned the stove off, but maybe I didn't turn the stove off. Back again, we have to check the stove to be sure. And yes, it's off. And then, how do you stop that? I know what I've taught some people to do is they have an obsession about the stove. So you turn the stove off. Okay. So then tell yourself, I have turned the stove off. I'm sitting here and I've turned the stove off. I'm looking at the stove is off. If I should get that thought when I'm at the office, did I turn off the stove? I am to remember that I told myself I turned the stove off. And because I turned the stove off, I don't have to go back to check it. It is off. I've got to trust that my memory of doing it is so. And so they can kind of talk themselves through it. But what a miserable life it is if you're worried all day. I took a friend of mine on a 2-hour trip, and we got about a half an hour from where we were going. We'd driven an hour and a half. I wonder if I locked my car. And I says, well, it's kind of late to find out. Well, I think I locked my car. Now, if I wasn't too far away from where her car was when I picked her up, I would suggest we go back and check it if it would make her more comfortable. But the better thing is to have her tell herself she's done it, to see that she's done it, to remind herself that she's done it, so she doesn't have to turn around or have somebody turn around their car in order to go back to find out whether she'd really done it, which she obviously had. Now, that's the kind of life that you could live with OCD. I think there are different degrees of it. I think some people get bothered by it more than other times. Well, we're coming close to time, so I'm going to close it here, and we'll just continue with this next time. Please join me then.